So I want to talk next about subdivision when it comes to sculpting. So you saw in the last couple of videos, I had started with a sphere that I had already subdivided quite a number of times, but even with that being done, we really quickly ran into some problems caused by low geometry. Now, we could have subdivided the sphere to a higher level before we began sculpting, but that is not a very efficient use of our time because we don't always know how dense we're going to need a mesh to be before we start sculpting on it. So, in order to get this sphere ready for sculpting, it needs to be denser. So, in the past, we have made our meshes denser using a subdivision surface modifier, but that is not going to work for sculpt mode, and let me show you why. Let's add a subdivision surface modifier, and we can even divide it a few times to get a relatively dense and smooth mesh. Now, I am in sculpt mode already, but you'll see that when I start to draw on this, well, it's not really working, and that is because the subdivision surface modifier does not allow us to sculpt on these higher levels of subdivision that we created. We can only sculpt on the vertices that are in the base mesh, which is not enough to get our sculpt working. So to solve this problem, we are going to use a different modifier. So the modifier we are going to use to subdivide our mesh for sculpting is called the Multiresolution Modifier. Let's add it now. Let's come to the Modifiers panel, click on Add Modifier, and come down to Generate and select Multi-Resolution. Now, nothing happens here at first, but you will see that here in the modifier stack, we have our multi-res modifier. We have a couple of settings here, such as level. This will tell us how many subdivisions we are currently viewing. So you will see that nothing has happened here because our level in both viewport and sculpt mode is at 0. So you may be thinking that, okay, to increase the level of subdivisions here, all we need to do is increase here. Oh, but clicking on that does not increase these numbers. And we need to be able to do that. So in order to use the slider functionality here, we have to subdivide our mesh first. So these sliders will not be functional until we press the subdivide button down here. Once we do that, we see that we have a level preview of 1 in all modes. Now, these different modes here are referring to sculpt mode versus object mode. This viewport level right here refers to object mode. So if I were to return to object mode with the level viewport set to 0, it would unsubdivide that preview. However, I can increase it by using the viewport level slider. Sculpt refers to how many levels we are viewing in sculpt mode. We have sculpt mode active. This can be 0. Tab into object mode and see it at 1. And render refers to our final renders, which we have not covered yet in this course. So do not worry about the render levels just yet. So once we have pressed this once, we can use these sliders, but as you can see, we can only go up to 1. That is because we've only subdivided once. In order to increase these sliders further, we would need to subdivide again. Now we have a maximum of 2 that we can toggle between. Subdividing again will give us a maximum of 3, and so on. So this multi-resolution modifier allows us to sculpt at any level. So for instance, we can come down here to our first subdivision in sculpt mode, and we can draw some large strokes on our form. The lower the resolution, the larger the form that it will create when you sculpt. So we've created this form now. We can come up to the third subdivision level at a higher resolution, maybe reduce the size of the brush a little. And if we start sculpting now, we have slightly finer detail. So this is great, but what is really cool about this is that if I decided I needed to change this larger form, but I didn't want to change these smaller ones, all I would have to do is return down to a lower level of subdivision. And let's press G for the grab brush. Let's increase our size a little. And let's just increase our size maybe a bit more by pressing F and increasing the size with the cursor. So let's just drag this in. So let's say I didn't want that larger protrusion. So all I needed to do was come down to the sculpt level of 1 to remove it. And now if I return to the higher subdivision, I still have my high-res details right here. So that is a really powerful functionality that allows you to quickly switch back and forth between large forms and smaller forms at will. Now, let's say we have made all these subdivisions, but we actually want to remove them for whatever reason. We can do this by using the Delete Higher button in the Multi-Res modifier. So if we decided we didn't like any of these changes and we wanted to return to a lower form of the sculpt, all we would have to do is return our levels, let's say down to 1. And now if we press Delete Higher, you will see that these sliders should return to 0, and the viewport one didn't return automatically, but once I clicked on it, it snapped back. That just appears to be a little graphical bug. Don't worry about that. But now if I go to these sliders and try to increase them, I cannot, because those levels of subdivision have been erased. You'll see that the changes I have made to the large shape of the form at subdivision level 1 are still there. This is no longer a perfect sphere because it has retained those changes. But now I no longer have my little smiley face because I've deleted that level of subdivision, and there's simply not enough information anymore to create that. So the last bit I wanted to cover about the multi-res modifier is this unsubdivide button. And you may think that it's just the opposite of subdivide, that if you were at, say, level 3 and you wanted to delete level 3 and return to level 2, you would unsubdivide. However, you're going to get this message that says not valid subdivisions found to rebuild a lower level. And I seem to have lost my cube or my sphere. So what that means is that keep in mind that the multi-resolution modifier is just that, a modifier. It is not baked in or applied to this mesh in any way. If we toggle the visibility, we can see we have the original sphere here with its original number of polygons. So the unsubdivide actually works with meshes that are already at a higher resolution. So what does this mean? Let's go quickly back into object mode and look at this mesh. And let's add a subdivision surface. Let's say we were modeling something and we added a couple of levels of subdivision, and then we decided that we needed actually more detail and we wanted to sculpt finer details into this. So let's apply this modifier. So currently this is the resolution of the mesh. If I were to now add a multi-res modifier, and let's say we were in sculpt mode, I could hit unsubdivide and Blender would calculate a lower resolution form that would not change the shape of this at all. So let me quickly show you. I'm just going to subdivide this a few times and I'm going to sculpt on it to show you how Blender maintains the form. So let's say this is your sculpt. Beautiful, I know. And let's say you were happy with this, so you decided to apply your multi-res modifier. Now to do this, we have to be in object mode, just like we are for every other modifier. So let's tab into object mode. And if your sculpt disappears, check your viewport levels, which are set to 0. Let's just slide that up to get our details back. So now let's apply this modifier by clicking the drop down or pressing Control A. And let's say this was the mesh, the base mesh you were starting with. Well, if you then decided you needed to make larger scale changes to this and therefore needed a lower subdivision level to sculpt on this, you could do so with the multi-res modifier, coming in, adding it to this mesh, and clicking unsubdivide. It may take a minute to calculate depending on the power of your PC, but you'll now see that this is a much lower resolution. But it has maintained all of the forms that I sculpted in at a higher resolution. So this is a very powerful tool for keeping your polygon counts relatively low while still maintaining all the work you have done. This is useful if you're bringing in a high poly mesh from another program or from another artist. You can still reduce the geometry and work at lower levels. So that is all I wanted to discuss for the multi-resolution modifier. Now there is one more method of subdivision for Blender that uses a more dynamic system. And we will be covering that one in the next video.